while there's been a lot of debate over HS2 in the last month or so, remarkably, one issue hasn't really come up at all, and that's the issue of fraud. And I say remarkably because it's a matter of public record that the Serious Fraud Office have been investigating HS2. And now it seems that we're on the verge of there being a decision on HS2. It seems absolutely incomprehensible that a decision could be made to go ahead with HS2 without knowing whether or not it's been fuelled by fraud. This first story in the Express last August was back when the Serious Fraud Office were looking into whether or not HS2 Limited had swindled people out of what their home was worth, or indeed not paid them at all for land and businesses that had been seized. With a second story in the Mail on Sunday a fortnight later, adding to it that the dossier had come forward, submitted, a lethal dossier submitted by whistleblowers. Now, the article goes on to say that investigators are looking into allegations of corruption in the award of contracts at HS2, and they were deadly serious about getting to the bottom of those claims. Since then, some of the whistleblowers have done interviews on the telly, and not all of the whistleblowers have gone public. There are more than the ones that people know about. But what's happened is that those journalists, and there are probably about a dozen journalists who've got the signed affidavits now, and a load of politicians, have never really gone into the full depth of the accusations, which make very specific allegations of fraud, bribery and corruption around the HS2 project. And I know that's hard to believe, isn't it? Because here in Britain, we like to think, oh, no, fraud, bribery, corruption, no, that happens in other countries, not here, and certainly not with the biggest government project ever, as if the biggest government project ever that's been mismanaged from the start doesn't present a rather tempting target. And it shouldn't be too hard to believe, because we've had things that are known to have been edging on this issue. Because back in 2015, HS2 Limited had a chief executive who was on secondment from a firm called CH2M, a man called Roy Hill. And during his time at HS2 Limited, a major contract was awarded to CH2M, his firm. An almighty fuss ensued. One MP, I believe, said it doesn't pass the smell test. And there were threats to sue by Mace, one of the losing bidders. And not only did the American firm CH2M relinquish the contract in the end to avoid any sort of suggestions of malfeasance or impropriety, but Hill left as well, replaced on a permanent basis by Mark Thurston, who oddly enough had come from CH2M and is now on £625,000 a year, the highest paid civil servant in the country. But far from everything that happened in that sorry tale is in the public domain. Anyway, what happened to Hill himself? Well, Hill went on to California to work on their high-speed railway, where he became Deputy Chief Operating Officer. And a situation quite similar to what happened there happened here, where Hill signed off a $51 million contract to a consortium of firms, one of which was Jacobs, who had since then bought CH2M, and it might have been the case that he had anything up to $1 million worth of shares in the firm he'd just given a contract to. Investigation ongoing, as far as I know. And it's very worrying that Boris Johnson may now be making a decision on HS2, not just before the project has demonstrated that it can pass the tests needed to receive official notice to proceed, which it just can't do, because it's got to demonstrate management capability. And all right, you might you've got to get rid of all the management, which I think he's probably going to do, but yeah, it still doesn't show that they're capable. Affordability of contracts, not one bit of HS2 is affordable or ever has been. And the robustness of a new revised business case, and bear in mind that it looks like loads of bits are going to be cut and the costs have gone up, like that's your business case finished before it started, unless you just make stuff up. But it might not just be making a decision before it's demonstrated it can achieve notice to proceed, because it can't, but also before the Serious Fraud Office have concluded their investigations. Because if the Serious Fraud Office were to find evidence of impropriety and malfeasance within HS2 Limited, or the contractors, or the civil service, then Boris Johnson would basically be offering himself up as a human shield, or possibly more usefully, as the person who appoints the Attorney General, who the Serious Fraud Office report to. Though, of course, if it were the case that an American firm had been involved, then the Securities and Exchange Commission might be interested of potential breaches of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And what could you imagine might happen during the Brexit trade negotiations, post-Brexit trade negotiations with Donald Trump, if that was the case? I mean, seriously, if there's any truth in these allegations, we could be looking at our very own Odebrecht. And Donald Trump is not going to bring that up if he thinks that there might be a chance that UK government officials were involved in a cover-up during the trade negotiations. Boris, can't you see that one coming? The idea that there might have been malfeasance within HS2 is... well, it shouldn't really be a surprise to anyone, because it should now be abundantly clear that we've been deliberately lied to about HS2 from the start. Now, the reality is that the cost of HS2 hasn't really gone up by 3 times since 2010, in the last 10 years, because 32.7 billion was never a worked out estimate of HS2. It was just a figure that was made up and put in front of an idiot politician to seem like an acceptable amount just to get the project off the ground. And now it's actually an established matter of public record that Parliament was misled. Deliberately deceived over the costs of HS2 for a number of years, which included times in which the project was voted on in the House of Commons, on costs that were known to be wrong, which have been demonstrated to have been known to be wrong at the time. And what? No one cares? That doesn't matter. And we're talking about billions of pounds of billions of pounds of overspent taxpayers' money, and no one seems to care that there are allegations of fraud, bribery and corruption, and we're still taking people who have a direct financial interest in seeing HS2 built at their word. And what has come out of the Oakerby review, or at least one of the leaks of the Oakerby review, is that it demonstrates that we have been lied to from the start about HS2. But right at the start, 10 years ago, when HS2 said they would do 18 trains an hour at 250 miles an hour, or 400 kph, I said, no, you won't. There's not a train in the world that does those speeds at those service patterns. Data trains back. Can't do it. Can't be done. And the reason this is massively important is that every promise that HS2 has ever made is based on the fact that it can do 18 trains per hour. And now it's admitted what we've said all along. Can't be done, won't be done. So that hits your business case. That hits your service provision. It hits these illusionary promises of freed up capacity. It hits everything that was used to justify the HS2 project in the first place. As does the other deliberate deceits, like pretending that HS2 would be a closed system like in Japan, where actually more of an open system like in France that imports problems from the existing rail network, which makes that 18 trains per hour even less likely. And there are so many examples of things that have been known to have been wrong since the start, that people like me have been pointing out for 10 years. And now they're being admitted, and there are so many examples of these claims that have been made up, the things that sound like they must be right, but they're totally counterfactual, and they're now known to be wrong. And the excuse seems to be over and over again, well, we've always done it like this. Like HS2 Limited, the government, Section 4 of the 2006 Fraud Act doesn't apply to them. Because what's been happening on an everyday basis might not be the sort of fraud that the whistleblowers have been talking about, but it's still fraud. Because if you actually read Section 4 of the 2006 Fraud Act, fraud by abuse of position, a person is in breach of the section if they cause a loss to one or another. Sorry, if they cause someone a loss, if they cause someone a gain, a financial gain, if they dishonestly abuse that position, and they don't have to have done it deliberately. Right? So you don't have to be pocketing the money yourself, but abusing your position in a way that causes someone else to make money, that's fraud. Abusing your position and causing someone to make a loss, like, I know, when you see someone's land without paying for it, or compensation for loss of earnings, that's fraud. You know, the High Speed Rail Act might give HS2 Limited the power to seize land. It doesn't give them the power to break the 2006 Fraud Act, no matter how much they like to pretend that it does. But that in reality highlights the problem with HS2 Limited. They think they can get away with anything. And you know what? They're right. They can. They have done. They have been doing. And if you give the project the go-ahead, Mr. Johnson, you're saying that's fine. And you're on the hook forever. And so are we. You might get rid of some of the management, but the premise, the principle is established. That, yeah, doesn't matter what you say, you're going to get away with it in the end. Because if we go back to the allegations made by the whistleblowers, it's a similar situation now to what we were when all things kicked off and it started to go wrong. When HS2 couldn't pass review point 1, a series of governance tests designed to make sure the public purse was protected. Very similar to the tests that HS2 must now pass to get notice to proceed, which seems pretty much impossible, to be perfectly honest, unless, like review point 1, we just ignore those tests that are set down to make sure that that there is governance and there isn't the ability to commit fraud, and bribery and corruption and that sort of stuff. And not only has it been suggested that it was decided to sidestep these controls and maybe not be totally honest about the numbers to make sure HS2 got voted through, but it's also been suggested that the unauthorised redundancy payments made at the time weren't a scandal. They were a scandal within a scandal, as one of the allegations is that they'd actually been made to get rid of and pay off anyone who wasn't on board with what was going on at HS2 Limited. Hence the rather large number of non-disclosure agreements former HS2 Limited staff have been forced to sign. I guess we'll find out about this, whether that's true or not, when the Serious Fraud Office investigation concludes. Hopefully there won't be a temptation to sit on the findings, especially as that tactic might seem rather more difficult if the SEC decide they want to get involved. So, there we are, Mr. Johnson. If you make a political decision to go ahead with HS2 now, you're deciding that all of what I've just said doesn't matter. You know, you're fine with it. And I haven't even mentioned things like the environmental damage or the way that HS2 will add to the climate crisis. You will be on this hook forever. And you will have sent out a message that while you're at number 10, it's open season, that scrutiny, that probity, that honesty, that none of them matter. This will be a millstone round your neck, and as more and more of this comes out against a backdrop of rising costs and money that isn't available elsewhere, it's simply not worth having your premiership defined by HS2.